Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I've listened to a number of speeches on this year's budget and this bill, C-47, the Budget Implementation Act, at all stages of debate. And I've been inspired by some of these speeches. I really enjoyed the one delivered by the honourable member from Abbotsford. He spoke about the lines the Minister of Finance said last year she would not cross, that being the increase in a ratio called the debt to gross domestic product. I agree with him completely. It seems as though this government, from so many of its ministries, tells Canadians what to expect from them and then ignores those seemingly brave words. Short-term deficits of $10 billion to bring back to balance by 2019. I remember that one quite well. A carbon tax that will never rise above $50 per ton. That was in the 2019 election, not so long ago, Madam Speaker. And I love these. We've got Canadians' backs. What does that even mean? We are laser focused on solving this problem. Sure. Maybe the one I like best, we're not worried about inflation, we're worried about deflation. Well, I think they'd like to erase those words from the record at this point in time. Talk is cheap in today's politics until Canadians actually see the consequences of breaking the real pillars that hold up our country's financial well-being. Reduced opportunities and an underperforming, non-resilient economy for generations. Social programs like health, education and welfare that will be compromised because bankers get paid first, and the amount of priority spending is increasing. That is the amount of money we have to spend as Canadians and Canadian taxpayers paying the interest on our debt. A rising rate and a rising number, so it is escalating quickly. Deficits do not solve themselves. They take planning, they take resolve. The consequences of not solving them are upon us. Rising inflation, rising taxation, and rising income inequality. Rising labour tensions like the recent strike at the Public Service Alliance of Canada, because Canadians are just trying to have their wages and salaries keep up with the rising cost of living the cost of living this government's negligence has caused. Inflated dollars buy less. Less food, less shelter, less services, yes, less social services. We are all poorer by degrees. The government just hopes Canadians don't notice it too much. Well, they found out that Canadians are noticing. And they're wondering how a modern country is throwing away its future and has forgotten the lessons of the last time this scenario unfolded just 4 decades ago. Politicians change, but institutional memory, the decision-making, should learn from the lessons of history, especially recent history. So Canada's debt to gross domestic product, what we call the debt to GDP as an acronym, I would say a somewhat useless ratio, as it only compares how bad our ability to provide balance for tomorrow's taxpayers is to other spendy governments in the world. The debt to GDP is increasing, and there is no benefit to having a high debt to GDP. There's only a cost, and a rapidly rising cost. As so many have indicated, that rising cost has rising consequences. This government presents its own set of data that its sacred ratio will peak next year, this time, at 43.5%. But let me caution colleagues on this opportunistic representation of data. And remember how this Minister of Finance last year said that this ratio had peaked and would not increase further. Words and promises without meaning or real intent. I think we know the answer to that choice. In fact, let's look at it on what's called a national accounts basis, as the rest of the world looks at these metrics. That is, there's only one gross domestic product, and there are a number of government debts in Canada. Add in each of the provinces on top of the federal government's debt, and you get a ratio that is higher than 95% on the ratio. We also have to subtract out the funds that don't belong to government that they like to include in their calculation. That's the amount they subtract from workers who have to set aside for programs like the Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan. And I should point out that is one of the costs to workers that's increasing substantially this year. Canadians need to tell the government these funds don't belong to you. They belong to the people that have earned those pensions. So get them out of your calculation that's trying to make your numbers more justifiable. This is not the government of Canada's assets. This is being held in trust for Canadians at arm's length organizations. The government has no recourse to these funds. Or does it? Does the government want to explain how it might have recourse to these funds that Canadians think are sequestered for their retirement? I ask this question because the government went out of their way to freeze Canadians' bank accounts last year. Freezing earned benefits would pale in comparison to freezing a basic bank account so somebody can buy food and pay for their shelter in Canada. In any event, for the financially literate, let's stop painting a rosier picture than reality. You don't get to pick and choose which numbers you use. Sustainable finance theories aside, and these are mock theories, Madam Chairman, you don't get to pick and choose the numbers that affect people's lives. Just present it factually. The irony is that this government presents a scenario where provincial budget balances have collectively turned positive in 2022 and thus contributed to Canada's overall turnaround. Let's be clear. That is based on the surplus in one province, Alberta, and those revenues are predicated on world resource pricing. Yes, oil and gas, that this government scorns daily in this House. As is said, in comparing badly run jurisdictions in the world, Europe is a collection of poorly managed economies with no resource wealth, whereas Canada is a very poorly managed country right now with a backstop of significant resource wealth. It is very clear this country needs better management. We're in line for the job and just waiting for the shareholders to fire this underperforming team. I went through much of the budget presentation, and I will note a number of fictions that this government actually prints on government paper. How's this? The federal government's fiscal anchor, reducing the federal debt to GDP ratio over the medium term, remains unchanged and is being met. Wrong. Or this, even with higher borrowing costs, public debt charges as a share of the economy are projected to remain at historically low levels. Wrong again. $44 billion of interest payments, up from $24 billion just 2 years ago, and a larger portion of the GDP than it had been in over 15 years. Yeah, the government says these metrics are going in the right direction and hope that Canadians are not paying attention. But they're emulating themselves in the House of Commons here by putting nonsense now on paper. Let's just keep spending and everything will balance itself. Well, how about this one? Budget 2023 proposes substantial measures as the next steps in the government's plan to crowd in new private investment by leveraging public investment and government policy. The goal of this approach is not to substitute government for the private sector, nor supplant market-based decision-making. It is to leverage the tools of the government to mobilize the private sector. No, it's not. It's fantasy. It's a false narrative based on giving taxpayer money to connected friends of this government. We're giving foreign companies subsidies amounting to double the amount they are investing in this country, to put Canadian taxpayers' dollars in the pockets of foreign investors. That's how this government thinks it makes friends. Who's laughing all the way to the bank? Not Canadian taxpayers, not the $200 billion of project financing that was in line in Canada before this government created absolute market uncertainty. What's not in this Budget Implementation Act? Well, anything to do with climate finance, just like last year. The budget speech indicated moving forward on climate initiatives, yet these exist nowhere in Bill C-47. What is in this bill? A whole bunch of items that have nothing to do with the budget. SEPA changes, jurisdictional oversteps, just tax, spend, and divide. It's not the way to manage Canada's finances. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Terrebonne.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue mon collègue qui a aussi siégé au Comité des finances. Je me rappelle de ces moments-là, lorsqu'on débattait de ces deux notamment. J'aimerais avoir un peu de clarté sur le sujet suivant. L'article 510 qui officialise la nomination de Charles comme roi du Canada. Une des propositions du Parti conservateur est de retirer cet article. Est-ce que le Parti conservateur est juste tout soudainement pris de bonne foi et de bon sens et en fait est devenu anti-monarchique? Merci.
The honourable for Calgary Centre.
Merci. Je suis désolé. Je ne sais pas la clause qu'il a indiquée dans la question. Sur une autre question avec les mots qui viennent avec l'article, ça va être un bénéfice pour la Chambre de communes. Merci.
Questions and comments. The honourable for Edmonton Strathcona.
Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague from Alberta for his intervention, though there was some dishonesty, it felt like, in that speech, and he did start by speaking about the dishonesty of the Liberal government, but he spoke about how this was almost an omnibus bill at the end, as if the Harper government wasn't renowned for their omnibus bills. He spoke about how we should have learned from history. But in World War II, one of the things that we saw was the massive investment in our communities, in our infrastructures. So I want to ask him about what he would cut, but what I actually caught my ear most in that debate was when he was talking about the pensions and about Canadian pensions, and I'm sure he knows where I'm going with this. We just finished an election in Alberta, and the UCP, the Conservative Party in Alberta, was actually running on the idea of taking Albertans out of the Canadian pension plan and taking that money so that they could use it for their own means. Does he, since he doesn't agree with the Canadian pension plan being used by the government, would he say that what Daniel Smith is proposing in Alberta would be just equally as wrong?
Good question. Good.
Member Calgary Centre.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague for this question, but it's a completely dishonest question, and I will say that this is something that has to be very clearly said in this House of Commons. There is no, we started the question saying there's some dishonesty in my speech. The only dishonesty in my speech was when I was referring to what's in the budget. I don't think I uttered a word of dishonesty in that speech. But there was nothing in the last Alberta election, which the United Conservative Party of Alberta won majority government in Alberta. There was nothing in there about pension plans, and yet the NDP in both Alberta and in this House seemed to take that as if it was a part of it, and it was a bunch of misinformation coming, and this information continues both in this House and in the provincial election. It seems to be repetitive. Thank you.
Just want to remind the member she had an opportunity to ask a question. If she has a subsequent question, she should wait until I call for questions and comments. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
A brief question.
I have put this question to other members debating tonight because over the course of any discussion of Bill C-47 in this place, I've heard very few members actually speak about Bill C-47, which is not the budget. The budget carried already in this place. We're now debating a Budget Implementation Act which changes many pieces of legislation. It is an omnibus bill, but it's not an illegitimate omnibus bill. It follows through on changes, and actually I voted against the Liberal budget. I voted and will vote for the Budget Implementation Bill because it contains many, many useful measures, none of which relate to the topics that my honourable friend discussed, because universally, it seems in this place, we assume that legislation, C-47, is the budget. And I just ask my colleague if he has any comments as to why that is, since that's not what we're debating tonight.
The honourable member Calgary Centre has 50 seconds to respond.
Well, that's an excellent question, and the member's exactly right. There's everything you can choose, part of which is the budget and part of which comes in this Budget Implementation Act. And I had here in my notes 10 different issues on the Budget Implementation Act that I could have spoken about today. And getting to them, of course, requires some preamble. And I hope she appreciates all the issues. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act that I did refer to in my speech, when is in the Budget Act, also we're changing words in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that we just recently put through in our own committee where the member actually attended as well. So there's a bunch in here that doesn't belong in here. And frankly, it is an omnibus bill and should be presented when we're actually amending those acts in Parliament, as we've just done with something where the government is clearly taking an overstep into jurisdictions that it doesn't belong in. Thank you very much for the question.